Um, I want to talk a bit about the background, and product management festival and peak product. So many of you know this. The flagship product of peak product, which is the holding company, are the conferences in Zurich and Singapore, where we get about 2,000 folks every year to come, learn, exchange, grow together. But we also do other things. We have a trends and benchmark study where we globally research the product market and talk about, hard facts and kind of trends in the industry. We do PM nights in many cities, mostly in Europe. We have several executive circles where, senior leaders come together, learn, exchange, and grow together. And then we have the INSEAD program, which is by now a very, very successful program with a very high NPS score. This is specifically about product folks that are basically at that intersection or about to make the jump to become really leaders. And we, together with INSEAD, we teach that program. And, we teach both senior PM skills, but also really leadership skills, which is what INSEAD is very good about. And the next class here is going to be in Fontainebleau in France in September of this year. The class is already almost full, so please get your applications in rather quickly. What is Peak Product? Peak Product, as I said, is the holding company of all the conferences, all those programs, but it's also consulting. So I'm leading the consulting arm of Peak Product, where we're assembled, I think, if I may say that, a team of world-class consultants that really have had huge impact on product work, and we're helping companies now, mostly in Europe, to really, kind of get up their game and have high impact products. So that's what we offer here as well. About me, many of you know me. I've actually spent, a long time at Google. I'm now working on the co-founder of Peak Product, where I'm personally doing the consulting area and also coach, CPOs and other business leaders. I have been a senior director at Google for a long time. I've been a startup founder. I've worked at Google Maps for a long time. I worked at Google Shopping for a long time. And I'm an angel investor in about 100 companies. So I'm sort of firmly in this space between business, product management, and finance and investing. And I do all of this as a passion with a passion for product. Good. Then, having said that, it's my pleasure now to introduce Jen and bring Jen sort of on the virtual stage. Fun fact, and I should say that, Jen and I actually we overlapped a bit, well, not all those years. She was actually even longer than me at Google, and she will explain this in a moment. And I've been only 13 years there, but we overlapped and we became really good colleagues and had actually a very deep connection. And we worked on complementary areas, which was also very, very useful for me and very insightful. So great collaboration. I'm now very happy that she joins us. And to talk about her journey from, IBM, a long time at Google, Lattice, and other stations. And with that, actually, welcome, Jen. Thanks for your time. And
thank you.
Maybe as a warming up question, tell us a bit about yourself and sort of the background and your journey in summary.
Yeah, well, first of all, just thank you for having me. It warms my heart to be here and to see you again as well. As you mentioned, we spent some time overlapping at Google, and just at a meta point, it's a lot of times it's the people that you remember when you look back on our journeys. So hello, everybody. I'm Jen. As Raphael mentioned, we overlapped at Google. I started at Google actually as an associate product manager. And worked my way up and figured out on the job what it means to do product management. Worked across various different areas to start with internal systems, billing, mobile, before there was a thing called iPhone or Android, Google search, and then shopping for a good part of a decade at Google. Which was just a bit of my baby, where we started product listing ads and was able to see the business grow tremendously during that time, and an opportunity of a lifetime. Long story short, after product listing ads, I decided to try my hand in augmented reality at Google. So learned a lot of things about finding product market fit, figuring out how to set up organizations for success. And then I left Google, which was huge for me after 17 years. Oh my goodness. And 4 kids too, by the way. So I was productive personally as well. But I wanted to keep pushing myself and to keep learning. And I felt like I can keep kind of trying out different areas. I can learn about mobile, I can learn about like AR, but I wanted to also learn in different environments as well. So I ended up joining Ethos Life in InsurTech of all things, which I had 0 experience in, learned a ton, and then found my home actually at Lattice. So Lattice, for context, for everybody, is a people success platform. Our mission is to make work meaningful. So this is very much on point. We build a combination of software with performance management, goals, engagement surveys, multiple facets to be able to support the employee experience. And this is where I've really found my home, so to speak, and an area where I'm both passionate about it personally and professionally. So it's a nice intersection.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen. So if we now dig a little bit into, those 17, 18, 19 years in total, right? And if keeping the lens in mind of this, interview, it's the intersection of product and business. Kind of, how would you describe this growth journey for yourself, right? And I guess in Google, since you were an APM and made it so far, I mean, there are not many APMs that made it to director, senior director, or VP. I'm sure there's probably a Google growth element to this, and maybe you could talk a bit about that and what growth meant for you, and taking on more and more responsibilities. And then as a second step, maybe when you then left, which I'm sure, and I know it was not an easy decision for you, what changed then, again, with keeping that lens in mind, right? I'm sure you were very attuned to the Google system and the Google way of doing things. That sort of what changed as well when you did or had a different context, right? And good and bad, or where were the challenges as well in adapting to those areas? But let's start with the Google journey.
Sure. So I'd break it out into perhaps like 3 main parts. When I first started as an associate product manager and grew to be a product manager, the first part was just focused on the product work. Okay, how do we make sure it's a good product? How do we measure success? How do we get things done? How do we work with the team? And the craft varied depending upon the area, whether it's billing and payments, where there was a lot more detail, whether it was search, which was very experiment driven. Depending upon the area, what you do and how you do it may differ. But much of the focus was on, okay, I am the product manager for this product. How do I make sure this product is a success? How do I work with everybody to get that done? So that's what I would put as my first chapter. I think the next chapter is actually when I started to become a manager of other product managers. And I'll admit, this was hard for me. And I was very blessed at the time. My manager at the time actually got me a coach because I was struggling with, well, like as a product manager, you don't code necessarily, you don't necessarily do the designs. So you're already one layer above or like abstracted. And then as a manager of other product managers, if I'm not writing the product specs, if I'm not like doing that, then what is my value? And then compounded with at Google, I mean, I was middle management to be very honest, and that's not a bad thing, but it is like, well, what's my value then? Well, what am I doing? And so I really struggled with this, and my coach really helped me kind of just tweak in my mindset with, you still provide value, even if you say nothing at a meeting. You still provide value. You're connecting the dots. You're understanding what's going on. You're bringing folks together. That is your value. You don't have to like try to sound smart in a meeting or give a question that was not anticipated just to like say, aha, I did something. You provide value in connecting sideways, upward, downward, and making sure that the overall, like, okay, how are we as a group moving forward? So that's what I would classify as my second chapter, and adjustment with there. And then the third chapter was actually a mix of, I would say, Google and post-Google too. So as I mentioned earlier, I left shopping, which was near and dear to my heart in many ways, and went to the wild west of augmented reality, where I had zero background in augmented reality, and imagine a giant, a ship trying to find product market fit. And we had to make hard decisions. We had to figure out, well, is this working? Because it was a newer space from an industry standpoint at Google, and then post Google, like it's a newer company, we had to try things. We didn't always know if it would succeed, but if we were starting to get signals, we needed to adjust course. And a lot of that then involved more organizational challenges. How do you set up the organization for success? How do you know if you have the right people? How do you know if you should continue onward pushing through with the project, or if it's time to call it quits, even if you don't have all of the experiment data at your fingertips that we would all love to be able to have to validate those decisions. But sometimes you gotta also understand the signals and make that call for the best for the overall business and the team too, which is like, okay, how do we set up our overall team for success? So I think that's been at the heart of I would say my third chapter, and hopefully more chapters to come. But yeah, I'd roughly break it down into those three.
Mm-hmm. No, wonderful. I think it makes a lot of sense. If I still want to try to compare the internal and the external parts of the third chapter, is there anything interesting to talk about there, like adjusting from a Google environment into, I guess, smaller companies that probably had also specifically high expectations to you? Is there anything specifically about learning maybe different sort of operating systems, companies, and also your role vis-a-vis maybe other executives and other important people in this different context?
I think within Google, even though I like moved in different areas, and there's certainly a ton of different product areas to learn about with the breadth of the alphabet, there was still that core Google with how things worked. And we were very also fortunate that there was a lot of processes set up. Even in newer areas like augmented reality, where like, okay, how do you do performance reviews? How do you even get promoted? What's on the ladder? What's the criteria there? How, like, okay, how do we, like, what are some of the processes we have, the checks that we need, or even the infrastructure that's in place to be able to launch, to be able to run experiments, to be able to validate, and then broad organizations and support large sales teams to be able to bring it to market and scale very rapidly. And outside of Google, what I found was it was less like it was an entirely, I imagine, like, oh, it's going to be like hacky, hackers everywhere. I don't know, I had this startup picture in my head. It's less that the day-to-day is very different. And in this day and age, we're all on Zooms nowadays too. But it's more that some of the things that I took for granted at Google may not be set up yet. Things like, well, do people know what level they even are? Or how do I even get to the next level? Or what does promotion mean? Or how do we set up some of these processes to make sure that we are checking the quality and checks and balances to make sure we're delivering a high quality product, but at the same time, still move uncomfortably fast given the critical need of that from a startup standpoint. And so the dynamic and what's already set up that I sometimes took for granted, whether it's tools or processes or other areas at Google, is different at a startup. But also, it's not a case where you just take what was at Google and then like replicate it at another company. I think for each company, there is an innate culture. There's an innate way of doing things. And so the big lesson that I learned is to not judge startups as a whole. But each startup has its own individual culture, has its own things that they prioritize when things get tough. How do people act? What's the bias towards action, bias towards metrics, bias towards the intuition? all of those different flavors contribute to the culture and how people work at a particular company. Even the same individual at a different companies would act potentially somewhat differently as well. And so that really stuck home to me with whether it's at a big company or a smaller company, it's ultimately down to the people and then therefore, how do we work together and how do we get things done together? And that varies depending upon company by company and culture by culture.
Mm-hmm. Great, great. If I look now back in your, like in you, right, in you being in this journey, in this like 70 plus 2 years journey, right, within Google and outside, I wonder, is it clear to you what the motivation was for you not to keep pushing and you know, make those really amazing career steps and then even leaving, you know, and having probably more responsibility in those 2 other companies? Was that always obvious to you in your career, you know, and if yes, why and when maybe? And if not, you know, what, maybe how did you discover that you wanted, you know, to push, essentially, push yourself and push your career?
I think there's 2 dimensions to it. One dimension is from a career ladder standpoint. Growing up the ladder from APM and working your way up, and in this case, like more from an executive standpoint. So there's that ladder progression. And then behind the ladder, there is, well, what do I want to do? What's important to me? What do I want to learn? And how do I accomplish that ultimately? And I think what I realized was early in my career, like many folks, it's kind of like getting an A in school. You kind of want like, okay, how do I get an A? And how do I graduate? How do I get to the next level? Tends to be not singularly, but one of the areas of focus as you think about progression. At some point, I reached a bit of a, I don't know, maybe an aha moment where I realized I can keep moving up or learning or growing in that like ladder procession, but I wanted to also not just prove to myself, but also immerse myself in new areas so I can learn about new experiences as well. So it oriented less from a ladder progression and more from a learning standpoint and a more individual growth standpoint, as ultimately, I mean, titles come and go and they are on the surface level to some degree, though certainly important. But ultimately, it's what you know and how you do things that you carry with you from place to place. And that is where I wanted to learn, like, okay, well, in a more ambiguous environment or in a new environment where I don't know anybody, literally anybody before joining the company, prior to the company, how would I work? And how would I learn and how will I adapt? And those are the things that I cherish, I think, moving forward in, I guess, the second half-ish or the third-ish of my career.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point you're making here. So it's basically, the second part was about growth and learning. I wonder, is it easy for you to pin down? Is this about product and, you know, product risk, so like function learning? Is it about skills? Is it about like difference, like just curiosity about maybe different areas? Is it about other functions, like working with marketing, with sales, you know, with executives? Or is it a mix of it? Or is it about you, maybe in all of that context and your own growth? Or is it a mix of everything? And so I'm trying to distill whether you had an inner voice in a journey, right, that like told you or that guided you somehow, right, in making all those small decisions that basically ended up being big decisions, I guess.
I think it started as more of a functional journey early in my career. Like, what does it mean to be product manager? And I never got an MBA. So in terms of, I don't have formal training. And that way I grew up at Google in product management, but with the mentality of do whatever it takes to, okay, what's needed? You want a big document? Okay, great. You don't need one. We're just going to go off the prototype and demos. Okay, great. What do we need to get things done? Because I never had that formal training. And in that way I was learning on the job and like, okay, what do we need to get this job done? But it was still more from a functional standpoint. Okay, what do we need to communicate? How should the product work? What should the design be like? What's in the roadmap? How do we see this product progressing? What's the success? All of those things I would roughly classify under more of a functional umbrella. I think the subtle difference or maybe addition that I would add from a functional to transition to more of a business or executive leader is more around the people. And it's a realization, especially as you then enter a role where you may not be writing the requirements, but you are supporting your team or you're supporting strong leaders on your team. Is how do you set up your team for success? How do you work with people? And yes, there are different functions from like go to market or how do you work with engineering? But ultimately, there's different people. There's a lot of different flavors of people and how people work. And so realizing like, okay, the importance of that. How do you set up incentives? How do you set up organizations? How do you work with different people? Ultimately, which is something I'm continuously striving to learn. And I think that is where I see a lot of the like more of an addition to the functional attributes is more of the ability to handle different situations, the resilience, and also working with different people at different levels with different backgrounds and functional expertise as well.
Yeah. I love it so much. I mean, you keep saying people, and I think I mean I know you, of course.
We're at a people success company now too, so
yeah, exactly. But I think it's interesting. I mean, everybody has a slightly different answer. Like, you know, some people say they want more impact. In my case, for example, I can say I was a lot driven to prove myself that I can grow and, you know, that I can take on more and handle it, even though that I also had a dark side for me or like a negative side, which is eventually why I left. But I find it interesting, like everybody has a little bit of their own lens or their own compass in what has been driving them. So I find it interesting. And I think that the people one makes a ton of sense for me, specifically like knowing you a little bit. Right? If we switch it around and say, in this journey, I'm sure there was stuff, and I know I had stuff I had to give up or stuff I lost, you know, in a way, or with hindsight, I could also, you know, argue why maybe I should not have done certain things, or at least I should have been aware of certain trade-offs in the journey. Is there anything that comes to mind for you of, you know, again, trade-offs or maybe costs for that journey?
So we were actually talking about this just a little bit before. When I've always been focused, because I grew up in product management, on like, okay, well, what do we need to get things done? I've said that multiple times. At some point, it was really hard for me, and I really struggled against the big P word of politics. And I hated it. And I don't hate many things, but I really hated it. And I remember talking to a mentor of mine. I was like, oh, I hate politics. Why can't I just get things done? Why can't we just do what's best? Why is this like, oh, it's driving me crazy? And in that same way, like, oh, there's reality and then there's perception. Well, reality is just important. Like, why can't we just focus on like the doing, the what are we getting done, the impact, the reality? What's this perception thing? Oh my goodness. And I hated both of those words, whether it's perception or politics, utmost hated it to the point that I almost avoided it. And a mentor of mine, as I was lamenting about this, said, well, but your team suffers if you don't do it. And that just broke my heart. I was like, oh, did you have to say it? Did you have to say it? And so I tweaked my head. And rather than looking at it like politics, I actually called it kumbaya, which works better perhaps with my personality of, okay, well, how do we kumbaya? Which was very relevant at Google. Okay, how do we kumbaya? How do we collaborate across these different product areas? How do we put these two products together? How do we get that done? My team needs me to understand like what's going on the other team so that we can connect the dots and figure out who does what. Okay, kumbaya, let's go, kumbaya. And for me, that slight tweak in verbiage from politics, hated, to, okay, kumbaya. And then also accepting that, you know, perception, I almost dismissed it like, oh, that's just perception. It doesn't matter. But I realized perception is important. It's an important part of the team morale, the company morale, as you rally towards a product. It's a signal of, hey, there's a delta in what's being done and what's the perception of what's being done that needs to get bridged in some way. It's how do we bring all these different people ultimately in different functions, but people ultimately together. That's also important. And so things that I once hated, I looked at from a different lens, and I saw, okay, well, there's value here, and there's work to be done here, and it's not just fluff work or thing. It's important work that's needed for the overall company, the product, and the teams as well.
Yeah, I mean, it resonates so much with me. You know, I think that's one. I was maybe one of the top differences for me from being a function leader to being an executive, is to accept the fact that reality is not what's in your head. It's essentially the system, right? You're judged by a system, and the system can be complex, right? It can be shareholders, stakeholders, can be a board, can be other executives, can be sales. And it doesn't matter whether I think I'm right or wrong, right? It's a lot about, you know, maybe competing views, perspectives, or complementary perspectives. And there's no right or wrong in this, right? But being able to actually understand kind of how the system is you know, seeing my work, maybe my team's work, what the system wants, where there's resistance, basically diagnosing a system, and then my role in a system is a huge one. I think that is different for me because it gives you, and like you said, right, if the ability to reframe it into a positive suddenly gives you control and gives you levers and something to work with, right? And I think it often stems, I mean, my experience on my journey, like from being judged could be a potentially hurtful thing, right? Nobody wants to be judged. But if you abstract it away and say, no, it's a system, right? And it's an objective reality, you know, that not everybody has the same view, suddenly it becomes a rational thing, right? And then you can abstract away from yourself. Maybe one is less defensive, right? I mean, I cannot count how often I felt these things are you know, something negative, but then exactly like you say, it also really become, I remember it like in shopping specifically when we overlap, right? The whole sales relationship was a big one for me as well, like really teaming up, right? And with those folks and opening a bit of a new chapter in relationship was a huge breakthrough for that specific system, you know. Anyways, anything you had to give up? I keep asking this, anything you had to give up, because you nicely framed it as a growth thing, but is there also something you truly lost in that journey, maybe where you sometimes you feel like, okay, this is truly something I'm not doing anymore, maybe, or I wish I was that naive or innocent? I can say for me, what I gave up in this journey is to some extent balance. You know, I always felt that's why I left in the end Google. It's just tough, you know, to every day align very competing things, right? And this executive job. But anyways, I want your answer to this question.
Interesting. And I'll admit this is hard because I tend to reframe things. Like, okay, well, how do I go from here? I think the thing that I say that I lost is I still do see it more as maybe less of a loss and more of a growth around like that like needing to do everything myself. and being able to do it in the way that I have in my head and then have it be like kind of translated out on paper or in a product. As I loved that part of product management. I loved the thing, like seeing the brainstorming and figuring out and okay, and then you seeing the solution and iterating upon it, iterating on the designs and getting it out. And it's not like I don't do that anymore. But it's just like, what does my team need me to do? And is it to dive in all the way? Sometimes, yes. But other times you also need to do things that may not always be fun. Setting up career ladders is not always fun. I will admit, doing things. And so I guess what I lost is perhaps a bit of that fun.
Yeah.
That I loved with the core function of product.
Yeah. The tweaking, the researching, the shaping,
like the doing.
Yeah.
There was a bit of that. There was a lot of that fun.
Yeah.
But what I did gain was more like the day to day. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. Sometimes I work on things that are like that are bring me joy, and other times it just needs to get done. But through that, having more meaning and perhaps especially at this stage in my life, like, well, what am I doing with my life? And what am I doing with the majority of my life that I'm working, a majority of my day that at least that I'm working right now? What's important to me? What am I doing for this particular company? How am I growing? Why did I come to choose why did I come here for? And how do I gain that growth? Which may not always be fun, but I look at it more from a meaningful standpoint and well, what's meaningful for me.
That's great. I love that. It's actually truly a very positive frame of this growth. It's really the meaning aspect of it, right? And the impact that you're having. And yeah, great. So I want to open up the floor in about 5 minutes. So if everybody maybe gets a few questions ready. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to please ask you a question in the chat. You can already start doing it now. But I would then call you out live, please, to ask the questions, just because it's a bit nicer to have an interaction. So please get ready with your questions. You can already start putting them in the chat. Maybe, Jen, one more from my end. Any advice, like having, you know, all these colorful elements of this journey and your, you know, reflection on it, if you could, you know, give your younger self any advice, or maybe, you know, indirectly, maybe for folks in this audience, anything maybe you would have done differently, or any other, you know, shortcuts or advice you would have for yourself or others in the journey?
I think whether it's at work or at home, I'll admit that I always put a ton of pressure on myself. Or okay, what's needed? Okay, a ton of pressure. And to be honest, at home, I got 4 kids, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of chaos as well. And then, okay, people sometimes ask me, well, how do you do it? And it's like, well, who says I'm doing it? I'm figuring stuff out. I'm juggling. Who says I have perfect work-life balance? But I just put so much pressure on myself to try to do it all, to be that super mom, to be like, and do everything that's needed for the team. And I think as I've grown both individually and professionally, one thing I've learned is to also lean on, I don't know, it comes back to people around you, and that's okay. Whether it's at home and I lean on people around me, even if I don't do everything myself, but to know that it's okay. It's okay if I forgot that school event. It's okay. And how can I get help for my family? And at work, like, do I know everything? No. Am I perfect? Hell no. Do I make mistakes? Yes, very much, very much. But to give yourself a break for that. And during the times when I have stumbled, or I have like struggled with a particular aspect of the job or at home, leaning on those around me, whether it's prior colleagues that I've reached out to, or friends, or even more professional coaching advice, to be able to provide that support for me and surround myself with that support. And I always thought that, oh, mentors, that's like something that more junior people need. But I actually think as you grow, whether it's peers or mentors or whatever relationship, surround yourself with people who can lift you up, who know you, who can help you think through things, and who can be there when you need them as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be my
I love
core.
that. No, I love that one. I wonder, maybe as a follow-up, since, I mean, you have been ambitious, right? Ambitious in your career. You have talked about growth and curiosity. So I'm sure there is an inherent trade-off in this advice you're giving here, right? Of pushing and growing and leaping, but also not being too hard on yourself. And, you know, maybe 80-20 or 90-10, I don't know what the fraction is for you. How do you resolve those two maybe potentially competing voices, patterns? How would you now, with hindsight, maybe look somewhat differently at, you know, important points in the career?
So I think for me personally, this is actually quite a challenge. I'm I don't know, I would say I'm empathetic by nature. And especially on areas like when I worked on shopping, it was like my baby. And so it just like, it just became so, became so immersed in it as well. And that amplified like all of the emotions that get associated with it. And sometimes at work, there are hard things that happen. And there are things that get you down. And it's thinking through, well, it's hard for me because that empathy, but even on Zoom, I feel it. I feel the other person's frustration. I feel the other person's like being upset. I feel it all, but also knowing, okay, like put that aside. It's okay. It's not me. I need to also like have a bit of that separation, and to not stop feeling it. I still feel it and I want to keep feeling it. I wouldn't want to lose that, but also to be able to step away from it and see like, okay, well, in the grand scheme of things, it's okay. It's okay. Well, I remember this 10 years from now, when I don't know, like I got a month later, probably not, then it's okay. And keeping that perspective has kept me grounded through the challenges of life and the challenges of work.
Yeah. You made one interesting point, and I know your empathy, and I think it's your superpower. And I was just reminded of this famous point, right, that sometimes a strength can become a weakness if you're not careful. And I think it might be exactly that, right? Like, because you're so empathetic, and I'm similar, I'm also very much a people person, it becomes a tool that it could be very helpful, but also it could become something that, you know, opens you up for negativity, or you might take on more for yourself, right? So I think being conscious about, you know, maybe a certain, you know, again, strength, and then modulating it, or maybe being you know, choose wisely, right? Where you invest maybe certain strengths, that maybe that could be a generalization. We're getting cool questions in, so I think we should open up the floor, and I'm just reading it now. So Ilya, maybe I'll do this in the end. This could be Ilya's question could be a good closing one. Let's do Shweta's question. Shweta, if you don't mind, maybe you could quickly speak up and ask a question live. That would be a nice one now.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer, for the wonderful session. So my question is, what is the advice you give most often to your team of product managers? What do you come across most often? The issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe I'll share a little bit of context first and then answer the question. I think for me, and maybe not your, and maybe at least imagine what your standard type A personality, like executive leader that you would imagine. And so the advice that I give to both myself as well as my team is know your strengths, know your areas of development, and you shine with your strengths. In your areas of development, you need to be good enough. But it's very rare that you take your area of development and suddenly it becomes a strength. And oftentimes we tend to focus on the negative and we think, oh, we're good here. So let's focus on the negative. What's the feedback? What can I do? Okay, what's not going, like, okay, how do I, and you focus on that, which makes a ton of sense. And not to say you shouldn't do that, you should absolutely. But also very much important is knowing, well, what are your individual strengths? And for each person, it's different. Each person has different superpowers, things where they shine, whether it's like, oh, I'm really good at the analytics, or I have a technical background, or like, oh, I love the strategy, or like, I'm really strong with design, or like whatever is your strength, and find ways to shine with that, because oftentimes, especially in product management, it's a fuzzy role. It's not like there's not always a playbook in many ways of how you get there. And so there are many ways to get there. So you use your strengths to get there and to help your team get there as well. And that would be my core advice.
By the way, this is so good for me that I wanted to quickly also +1 this one. I have exactly the same opinion about feedback and growth and, you know, profile. I think there is not a single one profile for PM to shine or win, or because everybody's different, every culture is different. So the only compass, I think, needs to be the own skill set and the own strength, and actually where you see, you know, the easiest impact for yourself, which is often kind of the strength. And really play on the strength. I've seen so many people be successful with very different, you know, profiles. So having the faith in the strength, and then I completely agree with Jen. The weaknesses are often only important if they hold you back. If they're good enough, that's probably then the marginal investment should be on the strengths actually, or the stuff you can really shine. But anyways, I found this a genius advice, Jen. Thank you so much. Justin, your question maybe would be good next one about pitfalls. If you don't mind asking it live, please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm just curious if you have anything to share in terms of, you know, what are some like pitfalls that you've seen among product folks that might keep them from going from, you know, a product manager to a product leader, and then if any, you know, as you become a product leader, anything or any pitfalls to avoid, or just things you've seen. I guess I'm kind of looking for like mistakes or pitfalls you've seen as people make the transition, but once they get there, you know, what did they do that held them back, I guess?
Yeah, it's also a really good question. I think there's a saying like, well, what is that? Like, what got you here may not get you there, something of that sort. And I think that's very much true, whether I look back upon my career or kind of as I look for other product folks on my team. And it's hard because you spend so much time honing, like, okay, well, what am I good at? And what do I like? Okay, okay, I'm really good at like let's say making presentations. Okay, I'm good at like the particular like the strategy piece. And so this is somewhat contrary to my last piece of advice, but sometimes you then focus on applying that to like different problems that may come up. And the way to think about it is that adaptability, that continuous growth. Yes, you may have done it X, Y, multiple times, similar problems before, but this is still a different situation, a different set of people, and a different context, or at least a different time period. And adapting to the environment, figuring out, well, okay, well, this is what worked for me before, but may not work in this context for me here. And so what I would say is sometimes we get stuck, whether it's we get stuck in the patterns, we get stuck in the outputs we are used to producing, we get stuck in the processes that we're used to, that we just go like, oh, I just want to like make the same thing. Like, that's just, why can't it be the same thing here? And instead of that, let go and figure out, well, given this situation, yes, from what I've learned, but what's best in this situation, and move forward from there. And so that slight tweak in perspective is what I would suggest, and also some of the areas where sometimes I feel I've seen people get stuck in their ways, so to speak.
Love it. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I would love to get more questions in, so please. I'll keep Ilya's question to the end. So I would love to get one or two more in.
Thank you so much, Raphael, and very nice to meet you virtually, and definitely will be interested to listen from the beginning at the recording, and impressed particular by the information that Jen was very productive personally, as well as it is such happy coincidence when person can self-realize itself in all dimensions that we have potentially. And the question arises particular because of that, and I would be interested to find such experienced mentor or instructor who would occasionally give me advice of how to best proceed with my as a founder, which I believe much, and trying to collect the puzzle from many dots and get these dots connected.
I'll let Jen jump in for a moment, but just before Jen jumps in, I just want to remind also Ilya and others, just because that is a question we get a lot as product management festival and peak product, just as a plug for that. This is the reason why we do the PM nights, the executive nights, we do the conference, of course, we do a pre-conference day or half day with the executives. I mean, this notion of community, getting input, getting, discuss stuff, is really one of the core reasons why we do all of this, right? I just wanted to plug and the INSEAD program, by the way, as well, right? Which is also like a lot about, a cohort that you stay in touch with and learn from. So, but I let Jen, of course, give her individual answer. I just wanted to give that wider context as well.
I understand.
Yeah, I love that question. And one, I think it was a YouTube video that I learned from. Someone mentioned that it's sometimes you think like, oh, you need a mentor when you're getting started. But I actually think it's even more important that you have somebody to talk to. Somebody who's not your spouse or your partner or like even your team to some extent, somebody that you can talk through, where you can really say, hey, I'm figuring this part out, or what should I do in here? And for some, it may be a professional coach. For others, it may be a community such as this. For others, it may just be a friend or prior colleague that you may lean on, but it is critical to have that. And even more important as you handle ambiguous problems or challenges with being a founder or an executive or new situations like that. And for me, I've been blessed with people who have taken the time out of their busy lives and careers to help me, either to share with me like, well, this is what I'm hearing you say, or to even repeat back to me, you know what you need to do. It's like, oh, but like, and sometimes you need somebody to be able to say those things back to you or help you see things in a different perspective. And I've been blessed with that. And it's something that I also just love to meet people around the world and people of different experiences, backgrounds, expertise, and to share with each other and to support each other through these challenges too.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So Victor has a great question about learning. Victor, maybe you could, if you could ask a question in person.
Yeah, of course. And thanks so much for doing this session. It's really refreshing at the end of the day here in Europe. I'm just curious, how do you keep learning after so many years of being like on the top of your game? How do you stay on top of new trends? What are some of the resources that you're tapping into? And most importantly, how do you make sure you carve out time? And how do you protect that time from everything else that's happening?
So I wish I could say I have a magical formula, or that I am very strict with like, oh, from 6 to 9, nothing. I only do learning on Fridays from 3 to 6 or whatever it may be. I'll be honest, I don't have that. After work, sometimes my life is a bit of a chaos at home. And so I don't have a particular like routine per se. But it's more of something that I do enjoy. And so when I have a free moment after the kids go to bed, I may watch a YouTube video or a TED Talk. I will occasionally read, though I need to do much more of that. But it does take a little bit more energy or time for that. And also just meeting with people sometimes and talking through challenges. And it doesn't always have to be like, oh, meeting from a mentor and learning. It could be peers. It could even be folks who were previously on your team and being like, oh, well, what did you do there? Oh, that's actually really interesting. And so I see it more as weaving it in throughout my professional or personal day. And there's various mediums, there's various forums, various content, especially like across the internet, on YouTube, but approaching it from that more incremental standpoint, rather than a allocated time where, okay, from Saturday from 10 to 4, I will make sure to read this and just focus on my individual development. The reality is life doesn't always work, at least for me, that way. And so I fuse it in to my work life and my personal life.
Super, thank you.
Ooh,
Any final question? Actually, if nobody else has one, I might actually have one, and this is sort of related to your last answer, but I want to give folks a final chance to put their question in, because it's also a bit, your time. But okay, I'll ask you the probably final question, and Jen, and this is related to sort of maybe organizing yourself. And my question is about energy, because when I reflect on giving up stuff, when I mentioned already balance, I felt that, I think we were on the similar level and both senior directors. I felt what I had to, the price I paid for, that journey was in the end, I called it balance, but you could also call it, energy. It all consumed me, that type of job. And I could do it. I'm sure I could have continued doing it. But I had those moments when I actually really had to ask myself, do I still enjoy this? / does it give me energy, right? And I reflected a lot on what gives me energy. And I concluded for myself that actually stuff like this here, in these conversations, or the conference, or the consulting we're now doing, where we're helping companies, that is sort of a new way for me to kind of actually get energy. Right? So long-winded way of asking you, especially with all those demands on what family, career, how about energy? How do you actually keep the energy? What gives you energy? What depletes you? Is this at all a dimension you think about, or are you just so energetic that you actually don't have to worry about it? How is this for you?
Oh, no. Let's just say I have no trouble sleeping. I'm tired at the end of the day. Energy, it's evolved for me over time. I'm someone, I could pull an all-nighter in college. I could push myself beyond my limits. I can give it my all. And even as a mom, for example, like there were lots of sleepless nights that I had to push myself beyond my limits, and I could do it. And I always approach that with, well, I'll just push harder. I'll just work harder. I'll just do more. And I also grew up in a family where it's much more about like self-sacrifice. My dad is a priest, actually. And so it's like, well, just do more, just try to do more, and that take it on. And over time, both professionally and personally, I learned it's really important that you also take care of yourself, as it's when you take care of yourself, and I think this is a quote from Oprah, but when your cup is full, that you're actually able to give it. And I always thought of it as a selfish thing. Like, what do you mean I'm going to have a day away from the kids? What do you mean I'm going to have a day without meetings just to like, what, think? Like, what do you mean? But I actually found that I like even the basics of making sure to eat, to like walk, to get some sun, taking care of myself, and that self-care, so to speak, makes you more grounded to take on the challenges, and for your, I don't know, for your cup to spilleth, so to speak, for the rest of the people around you. And so that's something that I'm much more conscious of now. And I'm much more careful with, well, I can push through it, but should I? And what's best, what makes sense longer term, or what's a way that I can step away and then come back, or make sure to take care of myself and then move forward so I can take care of others as well.
I love it. Jen, I can only thank you so much. I mean, this was one of the most inspiring sessions we ever had, and I think people also like let us know in the chat. I think this was a wonderful one. Really, thank you so much for being so personable and, you know, sharing really so much about your personal journey. There's a lot of love coming in the chat, so I want to really thank you for your time and the energy and everything. And yeah, I want to thank everyone else for coming and showing up. And this is also going to be on YouTube, like as usual. So send it around, share it with friends and colleagues. And yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks especially Jen for your time. And yeah, you get a lot of love in the chat. Please have a final look at the chat before you leave.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
A pleasure to be here.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.